The winter of New York in the late 1800s had a strange beauty to it. The streets glittered with the glow of gas lamps. Carriages rattled across cobblestones, and the air was thick with smoke from chimneys that belonged to the city's wealthiest families. This was the height of the Gilded Age, a time when opulence was not just a luxury, but a way of life. Behind the heavy curtains of Fifth Avenue mansions, there were grand banquets, laughter that echoed in ballrooms, and endless glasses of champagne raised to fortunes built on steel, railroads, and banking. The world of the city's elite seemed untouchable, as though its people were living in a glass palace far above the concerns of ordinary men and women. Among this glittering society was a woman whose beauty and grace had captured every room she walked into. She was not just another wealthy daughter of a powerful family. She was a figure who made the city pause when she entered a theater or strolled through Central Park in her silks and furs. She had the charm of someone born into privilege, but also carried a kind of fragility that others mistook for softness. In her early years, people adored her for the way she lit up conversations, her laughter bubbling out like champagne poured too quickly. To those looking in from the outside, her life was everything a person could dream of: a powerful family name, a mansion filled with priceless art, and invitations to the most exclusive gatherings in America. But perfection has a way of hiding cracks. Behind the polished mirrors and marble halls, there were whispers. Some said she was too sensitive for the sharp world she lived in, too trusting in a city where trust was dangerous. Others noticed the shadows in her eyes when no one was watching, or the way her hands trembled ever so slightly when she thought no one could see. The Gilded Age, for all its gold and glitter, was a cruel stage for anyone who faltered. To lose control, even in private, was to risk your entire reputation, your standing, your very identity. The city at that time fed on gossip the way it fed on money. Newspapers would print stories of high society scandals with the same appetite they reported murders in the Bowery. And for a woman of her name and wealth, every move was watched. The pressure to maintain appearances was unbearable, but she wore her role well, smiling through receptions and posing for photographs that showed nothing of the storm that was beginning to gather within her. Her marriage had been the event of the season. Carriages lined the streets, and the church bells rang long into the evening. He was powerful, older, and respected, a man who saw her beauty not just as an ornament, but as a tool for social power. She, in turn, was drawn to the security he offered, a place among the city's most influential families, and the promise of stability. Yet those who looked closer could see that it was not a marriage of equals. He was controlling, sharp-tongued in private, and believed that she was his possession as much as the paintings on his walls. She smiled when he spoke at dinners, but inside, she felt the slow tightening of a grip she could not escape. Tea first. The cracks were small. A glance that lingered too long on another man would earn her a cutting remark later that evening. A dress he didn't approve of was quietly removed from her wardrobe. The laughter that once came so easily became less frequent, as though she had learned that her joy came with a price. And yet, in public, they were flawless, a couple the city admired, envied, and imitated. To admit the truth, even to herself, was dangerous. She found her escape in small ways. Walks alone through the gardens, hours spent staring at portraits that seemed to understand her in ways her husband never could. Late nights where she would sit by the window and watch the city lights flicker while her thoughts drifted towards something darker. There were days she would not leave her room, claiming illness, her servants left to whisper about her behind closed doors. Those whispers traveled, as they always did, until the city began to murmur about her frailty, her strange moods. Her decline to IT was easy, then, for society to mistake her suffering for weakness. The truth was more complicated. Inside, she was caught between her desire to live freely and the iron grip of a husband and world that demanded perfection. She was drowning in expectations, and the silence of her gilded home became unbearable. People saw the pearls and diamonds, the gowns and the smiles, but they never saw the restless pacing in the dead of night, the sleepless eyes that stared into the shadows, or the moments when her mind wandered to places she feared even to name aloud. Her story was not one of sudden ruin, but of slow unraveling. Those who knew her well would later say the signs had always been there, if only they had been willing to see them. A fragile laugh that sounded too forced, a smile that didn't reach her eyes, an air of distraction when she was supposed to be the center of the room. Something inside her was breaking, piece by piece, though the city around her remained blind. And yet, the city would not stay blind forever. For beneath the glittering surface of her world lay the roots of something tragic. Something that would not only shatter her carefully built life, but also expose the hidden cruelty of the world she lived in. She had been the perfect image of a Gilded Age socialite, but perfection has its price. And soon, the crack she tried to hide would break wide open, revealing not just the fragility of one woman, but the dark undercurrent of a society built on wealth, power, and silence. The mansion grew colder even as the winter faded into spring. Her husband's presence filled every room, not with warmth, but with a kind of suffocating command. He was a man who believed control was love, and the more restless she became, the tighter he drew the leash. Their dinners, once filled with conversation and laughter, now stretched into long silences broken only by his sharp remarks about her posture, her choice of words, or the way her eyes lingered on something beyond his face. She tried to answer gently, tried to smooth over the cracks with charm, but the tension had settled between them like a heavy curtain that no hand could pull back. The city around them was in constant motion. Balls, opera nights, garden parties, but she began to see these events less as pleasures and more as performances. She had to play the role of the perfect wife, smiling beside her husband while gossip swirled around them like smoke. When she laughed too freely at another man's joke, she could feel her husband's hand tighten against hers, a small squeeze that felt less like affection and more like a warning. And when they returned home, those small moments of freedom were paid for with long arguments behind closed doors. He accused her of disloyalty, of flirtation, of weakness, and she defended herself with trembling words that only seemed to make him angrier. Tension deepened. She began to retreat inward. Servants noticed her withdrawing from the life she once adored. The woman who used to spend hours choosing gowns now left her maids to decide. She lingered in her chambers, refusing callers, staring at the same letters and photographs as though searching for some answer in them. There were moments when she would press her hand against the window, her eyes wet, as though she were looking for a world beyond the iron gates of the mansion. But there was no escape. Her husband knew every movement she made, every step beyond the walls. His obsession with her purity, with her loyalty, grew sharper, and his suspicion became a constant presence. Rumors in the city began to shift. What had once been whispers about her fragility now turned into questions of her stability. Some said she had inherited a nervous disposition from her mother, who had herself been known to take to bed for weeks at a time. Others claimed her husband was too harsh, too demanding, his temper breaking her spirit. These speculations fueled the society pages, but in truth, no one outside the house knew how far the cracks had spread. Behind the heavy velvet curtains, the battles were becoming louder, the silences more dangerous. One evening, at a gathering held in one of the grand ballrooms of Fifth Avenue, everything began to unravel in public view. She appeared radiant in pearls and silk, her smile dazzling, her laughter clear, but beneath it all, her eyes darted like a cornered animal's. She drank more than usual, her words spilling faster, her hands trembling as she clutched her glass. Her husband's jaw tightened as he watched her, his anger barely concealed. At one point, she danced too closely with another man, her laughter echoing above the music. Guests noticed the sudden frost in her husband's expression. Later, when they returned home, the argument that followed shook the walls. Servants whispered about the shouting, the sound of objects breaking, and her sobs that went on long into the night. After that evening, things grew darker. She stopped leaving the house altogether. Carriages came to take her to luncheons, but she refused to step inside. Invitations piled on her desk, unopened. Her husband became more controlling, instructing staff to keep watch on her, to report where she was and whom she spoke to. He believed she was hiding something. Letters, perhaps, or secret meetings. The truth was simpler and far sadder. She was hiding only from him, from the crushing weight of his expectations, from a life she no longer recognized as her own. But there were secrets in her past, too, shadows that crept back into her thoughts in moments of quiet. Before her marriage, she had loved someone else, a man without wealth, without title, but with a warmth that made her feel free. Her family had torn that love away, insisting she marry for status and power, not for the fragile dreams of the heart. She had done as they asked, sacrificing her desires for the security of a name and fortune. But now, years later, in the silence of her gilded cage, the memory of that lost love returned to haunt her. Sometimes she would close her eyes and see his face, and it filled her with both comfort and unbearable pain. Her husband sensed these ghosts without ever knowing their details. His paranoia grew, twisting into obsession. He accused her of betrayal without evidence, his jealousy needing no reason beyond her quietness, her distant stares, her refusal to meet his eyes. Every silence was an insult, every sigh a secret, every tear proof of some imagined disloyalty. His voice rose more often now, sharp words cutting through the house like knives. And she, growing weaker, no longer fought back. Money, too, became another weight pressing down on their marriage. For all his wealth, her husband had invested poorly in recent years, speculating in ventures that were beginning to collapse. Railroads that once promised fortunes now threatened ruin. He never spoke of it to the outside world, but she felt his anger, his desperation. The grand lifestyle had to be maintained at all costs, and she was expected to play her part, to smile, to dazzle, to convince society they were untouchable. The pressure to hold up the illusion became unbearable. She was not only his wife, but also his mask, and he refused to let her falter. It was during these months that her mind began to fray more visibly. She spoke less, ate little, and paced the halls at night like a restless spirit. Servants told of finding her weeping in empty rooms, her hands pressed to her temples as though trying to keep her thoughts from spilling out. Sometimes she muttered to herself, words too low to hear, her eyes wide with fear. The woman who once commanded every room she entered was dissolving before their eyes. And yet, in public, she was still paraded out when needed, dressed like a doll, her smile painted on as carefully as rouge. A sense of dread began to cling to the household. Guests noticed the unease, the way her laughter rang hollow, the way her husband hovered too closely. Friends who once adored, visiting now, made excuses, unwilling to witness the tension. Even the servants whispered about the madness settling into the house, as though the walls themselves had absorbed the pain and anger. Each day felt like the tightening of a noose. She was trapped in a marriage that offered no kindness, watched by a husband whose obsession grew more dangerous, haunted by memories of a lost love and pressured by a society that demanded perfection. The weight of it all pressed down on he, until her mind, already fragile, began to fracture. What was once a life of privilege and admiration was now a prison. Every look from her husband felt like an accusation, every silence like punishment, every social event a battlefield she could not win. And though the city outside still glittered with wealth and beauty, inside her home, the tension had become unbearable. Something had to give. Something would break. The night of the breaking point was one of those heavy summer evenings when the air itself felt restless. The city outside the mansion still glittered, music drifting from carriages, lamps glowing through lace curtains. But inside, the house was heavy with silence. The servants had long since retreated, sensing the tension that hung in the air like the thick humidity. She sat alone in her room, staring at her reflection in the mirror. Her face was pale, her eyes dark, her beauty dimmed into something haunted. A letter lay crumpled on the desk beside her, though no one but she would ever know what it said or who it was meant for. It was only another secret her husband had torn from her hands earlier that evening. Demanding explanations she could not give, he entered without knocking, his footsteps sharp again. Esti the floor. His presence filled the room before his words did, his eyes burning with suspicion. He accused her again, of betrayal, of disgrace, of shaming his name with her silence and her secrets. She rose to defend herself, her voice breaking, her hands trembling as she swore she had done nothing. But to him, her tears were not proof of innocence. They were proof of guilt. His voice rose, sharp and brutal, echoing against the walls as he cornered her. He called her a liar, a fraud, a woman unworthy of his name. And something in her snapped. For years, she had endured his control, his cutting words, the suffocating weight of expectations. For years, she had pressed her pain into silence, hiding the fractures of her mind behind jewels and silks. But on this night, the silence broke. She screamed back at him, words spilling out like fire, accusing him in return, not only of cruelty, but of stealing her life, of chaining her to a world she never wanted. Her voice was raw, ragged, filled with years of swallowed rage. For the first time, she stood before him not as his possession, but as a woman consumed by fury and desperation. The argument spiraled quickly, each word sharper than the last. He moved closer, his hand raised, not yet striking, but threatening enough. She flinched, her breath shallow, her heart hammering. The room seemed to shrink around her. The walls pressed in, the air thickened, and the sound of his voice grew louder until it drowned out everything else. And then, in one terrible moment, instinct took over. Her eyes darted to the heavy object on the desk, a silver candlestick, polished and gleaming in the low light. She seized it without thinking, her hands trembling as she lifted it. He stepped toward her, his face twisted with rage, and in that instant, something inside her broke entirely. The years of fear, humiliation, and silence all erupted in a single motion. With a cry that was part scream, part sob, she swung. The blow landed with a sickening sound, the weight of silver meeting flesh and bone. His body staggered back, his eyes wide with shock as he clutched his head. Blood spilled quickly, dark against the pale carpet, spreading in a stain that seemed to grow with each heartbeat. He gasped, reaching out as though to steady himself, but she struck again, her mind lost to a storm of fear and fury. The second strike silenced him, his body collapsing heavily onto the floor. The room fell into a terrible stillness. The only sound was her breath, ragged and desperate, the candlestick slipping from her bloody hands to the floor with a dull thud. She stood frozen, staring down at the man who only moments ago had towered over her. Now he lay crumpled, his face slack, his blood pooling beneath him. The reality of what she had done crept in slowly, like ice spreading through her veins. Her chest heaved as she whispered his name, as though calling it could undo the moment. But there was no answer, no movement, only silence. Panic seized her. She stumbled backward, nearly tripping. G on her own skirts, her hands shaking as she pressed them to her mouth to keep from screaming. She wanted to run, to flee the room, but her legs felt heavy, rooted to the floor. Her eyes darted to the door, to the windows, to the blood, to his lifeless body. The walls seemed to close in tighter, the air thicker, the silence louder. She told herself it was an accident, that she had only meant to stop him, to protect herself. But the sight before her told another story, one that no one in society would ever forgive. Her mind raced, spinning through denial and despair. She imagined the whispers that would follow if anyone knew, the headlines, the disgrace, the end of her family name. She thought of her lost love, of what her life might have been, and the cruel irony of what it had become. She thought of the parties, the jewels, the smiles, and how none of it mattered now. All that remained was the body of her husband on the floor and the blood on her hands. The immediate aftermath was chaos, though most of it raged inside her mind. She knelt beside him, her fingers brushing against his still warm skin, desperate for any sign of life. But the truth was undeniable. She rocked back on her heels, her body trembling, a low moan escaping her lips as though her grief and horror could break the silence. For a moment, she considered calling for help, but then she imagined the faces of the servants, their eyes wide with judgment, their whispers traveling like wildfire through the city. She could already hear the headlines: Gilded Age socialite murders husband in madness. Instead, she moved clumsily, almost blindly. She pulled a blanket from the bed and draped it over his body, as though hiding him could make him vanish. Her hands left smears of red across the fine fabric, and when she caught sight of them, she scrubbed them against her gown until the stains spread further. She was unraveling, her mind spiraling between clarity and delirium. The house was silent except for the ticking of the clock on the mantel. Each second felt like a hammer against her skull, reminding her that time was moving forward, that this moment could not be undone. She thought of escape, of packing a bag, of running into the night. But where could she go? She was a woman of name and face, recognized everywhere. The city would find her. The world would condemn her to she sat instead, collapsing into a chair, her body shaking uncontrollably. Her eyes stayed fixed on the shape beneath the blanket, her breath shallow, her thoughts fractured. Hours might have passed, or minutes. It was impossible to tell. She drifted between reality and a kind of waking nightmare, where the sound of his voice still rang in her ears and his eyes still glared at her from the shadows. The crime had been quick, brutal, and final, but its weight settled heavily, pressing down on her until she could barely breathe. In that room, surrounded by the wealth and beauty that once defined her life, she was no longer the admired socialite of New York's elite. She was something else now, something society would never forgive, something even she could not forgive herself for. The gilded world she had once lived in was shattered, replaced by blood, silence, and the echo of a single, terrible act. The crime had unfolded in seconds, but its shadow would stretch far longer, consuming everything she had ever been. The morning after the crime, the house seemed to breathe differently. The servants moved in hushed steps, their eyes averted, though none of them yet knew the truth. She had spent the night locked in her chambers, the curtains drawn against the dawn, her body still in the gown from the evening before, the fabric stiff with blood that she had tried in vain to wash away. The candlestick had been cleaned clumsily, its shine dulled by her frantic hands, but the stains on the carpet, the dark blotches that no rug could hide, remained. She sat in a chair by the window, her eyes wide and vacant, staring out at the empty street. Time had lost meaning. The ticking clock, the faint sounds of the city stirring awake, all of it passed around her while she remained frozen in that moment. Denial came first. She told herself he might still wake, that perhaps he had only fainted, that if she opened the door to his study, he would be there, alive, angry as ever, but still present. Yet when she crept back into the room, the air heavy with the copper scent of blood, the sight of his still form under the blanket brought the truth crashing down again. She backed away, her hands trembling, whispering apologies into the emptiness as though he could hear her. By midday, whispers began to ripple through the household. The master had not risen. His meal sat untouched. The servants exchanged wary glances, their fear growing with each unanswered knock at his door. When finally one of them pushed inside, the scene struck like a thunderclap. The muffled scream of a maid carried through the halls, and in moments, chaos consumed the mansion. Servants rushed in, their gasps and cries filling the room. Word spread quickly. The master was dead, his body cold, his head bloodied, the great man of the house fallen in the most shocking of ways. She was found in her room, her hands pressed over her ears, rocking slowly as though she could block out the sound of their voices. When I asked what had happened, she could barely speak. The words came broken, half-whispered. Some say she confessed immediately, her voice soft and resigned. Others claimed she rambled incoherently, blaming shadows, fate, or her own madness. Whatever she said, it was clear to all that something inside her had fractured beyond repair. The news spread through the city like wildfire. By evening, the newspapers were already carrying the story. The tragic death of a wealthy man, the shocking downfall of his wife, the whispers of scandal that gripped New York high society. Headlines blared of madness, of passion, of betrayal. Some papers painted her as a fragile woman driven to desperation, a victim of cruelty who had finally broken under its weight. Others were less forgiving, calling her a murderer, a disgrace to her family name, proof that even the glittering world of the elite was rotten at its core. Her family was devastated, not only by the crime itself, but by the public shame it dragged onto their name. Brothers and cousins who had once stood proudly beside her now spoke of her in hushed tones, distancing themselves as though the very mention of her might stay. In them, her mother wept in silence, rarely leaving her room, while her father raged at the disgrace, calling her ungrateful, weak, and cursed. Friends who once filled her home vanished overnight. Their letters returned unopened, their faces absent from her side. In the world she had once ruled, she was now untouchable. The law descended quickly. The authorities questioned the servants, gathered what evidence they could, and soon she was taken from her home, her hands bound, though her body seemed too fragile to resist. Crowds gathered to see her escorted into the carriage, their eyes hungry for the sight of a fallen queen. Some shouted insults, others whispered prayers, but all watched with the same fascination, as though she were no longer a person but a symbol, a story to be told and retold. Inside the jail, she became a shadow of herself. The silks and jewels were stripped away, replaced by coarse garments that made her appear almost unrecognizable. She sat for hours in silence, her eyes fixed on nothing, her lips moving in prayers or apologies that no one could understand. At times, she wept uncontrollably, her sobs echoing through the cold stone walls. At other times, she laughed softly, a sound that unsettled even the guards, as though her mind had drifted to some place beyond reason. The trial became the spectacle of the year. Courtrooms overflowed with people desperate to witness the fall of a woman who had once embodied grace and beauty. Journalists crowded the benches, their pens scratching furiously as they captured every detail of her appearance, her trembling voice, the pale hands that twisted in her lap. Some papers spoke of her as a tragic figure, a victim of a cruel marriage who had been driven to madness. Others painted her as a calculating murderer, a woman who had hidden her darkness beneath diamonds and pearls until the night it spilled out in viol. NCE, her lawyers argued for mercy, painting her as a woman undone by years of emotional torment, by a husband who had controlled and crushed her spirit. They spoke of her fragile health, of her descent into nervous fits and melancholy, of a mind too delicate to withstand the life forced upon her. But the prosecution painted another picture, one of a woman who, consumed by jealousy and pride, had struck down the very man who gave her everything. Their words dripped with condemnation, and the crowd, hungry for judgment, leaned forward with each accusation. Through it all, she sat silently, her eyes vacant, her body trembling. There were moments when she seemed not even to hear what was being said, her mind adrift, caught in memories of laughter long gone, of love lost, of nights spent staring at the city lights from her window. In rare moments of clarity, tears would slip down her cheeks, her lips parting as though to speak, but no words came. The verdict was inevitable. Guilty, not of murder, but of manslaughter, tempered by the court's acknowledgement of her fragile state of mind. Yet the punishment was severe, confinement in an asylum, her name forever marked, her reputation destroyed. For the rest of her days, she would not be remembered as the dazzling socialite who once commanded every room, but as the woman who lost herself, who broke under the weight of her life and committed the unthinkable. The asylum became her final stage. Behind its iron gates, Her life dwindled into routine. Days blurred into nights, the walls closing in tighter than the mansion ever had. She wandered its halls with other broken souls, her once bright beauty fading into pallor, her laughter gone, her voice rarely heard. Sometimes she would speak of her husband, whispering his name with a mix of love and fear. Other times, she would deny ever knowing him at all, as though erasing him might erase the horror of what she had done. Outside, the world moved on. Her story became a cautionary tale, whispered at dinners, written about in novels, speculated on by those who had never known her. Some pitied her, some despised her, but all agreed that her fall was a tragedy born of wealth, power, and silence. She had been the perfect image of the Gilded Age, and her downfall revealed the rot beneath the gold. Her family name survived, though scarred. Her relatives rebuilt their reputations, but her memory was quietly erased from portraits, her name left unspoken in polite company. To speak of her was to risk reopening wounds that society preferred to forget. Yet in quiet corners, her story lingered. Servants still remembered the sound of her laughter before it faded, the way her eyes once lit up before shadows overtook them. Old newspapers still carried her face, her beauty forever frozen in photographs that no amount of disgrace could erase. The aftermath of the crime was not only her ruin, but a mirror held up to the society she had lived in. It showed the cruelty of expectations that crushed women beneath the weight of perfection, the silence forced upon those who suffered, and the dangers of a world where appearances mattered more than truth. She had been a victim and a perpetrator, fragile and violent, adored and condemned. And in the end, she was left with nothing but the echo of her own tragedy, a story that lived on long after her voice was silenced. Her story did not end with the clang of the courtroom gavel, nor even with the iron gates of the asylum closing behind her. It lingered in whispers in yellowed newspapers, in half-remembered anecdotes traded across dinner tables. Yet for her, the end was quieter. The asylum walls dulled the sound of society's judgment, though they could not silence the echoes in her mind. She lived on in a half-life, stripped of jewels, stripped of standing, stripped of the woman she once had been. What remained was a figure both pitied and feared, a cautionary tale that haunted the city long after her beauty and laughter had been erased. For her husband, death granted neither dignity nor peace. His name, once spoken with respect in every drawing room, became entangled with scandal. Some remembered him as a cruel man whose harshness may have pushed his wife to the breaking point. Others mourned him as a victim of betrayal, a man who had offered everything and received blood in return. The truth, as always, was more complicated, lost somewhere between admiration and condemnation. His fortune passed to distant relatives, his estate carved apart by disputes, and the empire he built on power and pride slowly dissolved. Even in death, control slipped from his grasp. Justice, in the narrow sense of the law, was served. She was confined, punished, labeled. Yet justice in a larger sense felt elusive. Could there ever be justice for a woman driven to madness by years of suffocating control? Could there be justice for a man whose life ended in violence, no matter his flaws? The court had written its verdict, but the city itself remained divided, some calling her guilty, others seeing her as another victim of a gilded world built on silence and power. Her family carried the heaviest burden outside the asylum walls. For them, the tragedy was not only personal but public. They lost not just the Ugter, but their standing, their comfort in society, the certainty that their name was untouchable. They lived with the constant shadow of her downfall. At gatherings, when her name was avoided, the silence said more than any words. Her mother, once known for her elegance, aged rapidly, her grief etched into her face. Her father, proud and unyielding, carried the bitterness of betrayal until his last days, convinced that his daughter had undone everything he had worked to build. Brothers and cousins rebuilt their lives, but in each of their stories, there was a gap where she should have been. For the city, her fall was entertainment as much as tragedy. The newspapers devoured her story, weaving it into parables of morality, warnings of unchecked emotions, or salacious gossip meant to sell copies. Society, which had once adored her, now used her as an example of what happens when perfection cracks. Yet beneath the sensationalism, her case revealed something deeper. It exposed the fragility of the world the elite had built, where appearances mattered more than truth, where women were bound by invisible chains of duty and reputation, and where silence often masked unbearable suffering. Her story touched on themes that went beyond one crime. It forced questions about morality and power. Was her act one of evil or one of survival? Was she a murderer, or was she another casualty of a world that valued control over compassion? In her marriage, the imbalance of power was clear. He held authority. She was expected to submit. But when the balance tipped, when she seized control in a single violent act, the world recoiled. A woman was not meant to wield power, not even in desperation. Her punishment, in part, was not just for the crime itself, but for daring to shatter the role society had written for her. The case also highlighted the way wealth shaped justice. Another woman, from a poorer family, might have faced execution or lifelong imprisonment. She, because of her status and fragile condition, was sent to an asylum, her punishment softened by pity and her family's influence. Society condemned her, but also protected her, unwilling to let the spectacle of her death stain their own image. This hypocrisy, though rarely spoken of, was clear to many. Justice in the Gilded Age was not blind. It was gilded itself, bent and reshaped by the weight of names and fortunes. In reflecting on her story, it is impossible not to see the layers of human behavior it revealed. Love twisted into control, loyalty curdled into resentment, beauty eroded by fear, and silence that grew so heavy it shattered in violence. Each person involved, her husband, her family, the society that watched, played a part in her undoing. The crime was not born in a single night, but over years of repression, fear, and loneliness. When the final moment came, it was less a choice than an eruption of all the pain that had been buried too long. And so her tale became both a tragedy and a mirror. A tragedy for the lives ruined, the family broken, the woman destroyed by her hand as much as by the world around her. A mirror for the society that judged her, forcing it, if only briefly, to see its cruelty reflected. She was a woman gilded in beauty and wealth, but beneath the gold was suffering that no one cared to see until it spilled into blood. In the end, she faded quietly, her name forgotten in polite circles, her life reduced to a footnote in histories of scandal. Yet her story lingers, not because of the crime alone, but because of what it revealed about the fragility of human lives caught in the grip of power, pride, and silence. She was not just a socialite who lost everything to madness. She was a reminder of how thin the line is between glamour and despair, between control and cruelty, between silence and a scream. Her life closed not with applause or admiration, but with whispers and shadows. The woman who once defined beauty and grace became the ghost of a lesson society tried not to learn. And though the world moved on, glittering again with new names and new scandals, her story remained in the corners, fragile, haunting, and unresolved.